I didn't cry when they told me it was cancer. No, I just sat there, quiet as I've always been. I folded the paper the doctor had given me, placed it neatly into my bag, and said thank you. It was as though I was paying a bill, some inevitable charge I'd known was coming. When the doctor left, I stayed seated in that sterile room, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. There wasn't any panic. Not then. It wasn't until I reached the car that the weight of it all hit me. Stage 3 colon cancer. The words echoed in my head, but the emotions they should have triggered didn't come. At first, I felt nothing, just a dull numbness that settled into my bones. But as I pulled out of the parking lot and into the steady rhythm of traffic, the tears came. Only they weren't tears of fear or sorrow. No, these were tears of shame. I didn't want to be a burden. I've always done everything on my own, managing life's messes as they came. I've carried more than my share, and I've never asked anyone for help. But now, with this diagnosis, I was faced with the one thing I couldn't manage by myself, and it made me feel small, insignificant, like I was about to become just another burden in the long line of things to manage in Derek's life. I reached home, parked the car, and just sat there, staring at the front door. I wanted to go inside, but somehow the thought of facing Derek felt impossible. I had to tell him, of course, but what would I say? How could I even ask for what I needed when I already knew how he would react? Eventually, I opened the door and stepped inside. Derek was in the kitchen, his back to me, fiddling with the stove. The sound of the pots clanging felt hollow, distant, as if it were happening in another world. "Hey, Mom, you feeling okay?" His voice was casual, too casual, and I hated the way it made my stomach tighten. I placed the papers on the counter, letting the silence stretch between us. "I'm not okay, Derek," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "The doctors confirmed it. I've got cancer." He turned to me, eyebrows raised. The look on his face wasn't shock, wasn't even surprise, it was just confusion. He blinked twice, rubbed the back of his neck, and said, "That's a lot, Mom." He paused, as though he were unsure of what to say next, then grabbed a soda from the fridge and tossed it to me. "Do you want one?" he asked. I just stared at him. For a moment, I didn't know what I wanted more, to scream or to fall apart right there on the kitchen floor. But instead, I nodded and took the soda, because that was easier. That was what I was supposed to do. The silence stretched, and we both knew he wasn't really listening. He was too busy thinking about the next thing, his fiancée Hannah, their wedding plans. "I'll need to be near hospital for treatments," I said, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Can you drive me? I'll need someone to take me to appointments." He gave a short, distracted nod. "Of course, I can stay. I mean, it's your house too." It wasn't exactly reassuring, but I tried to ignore the coldness in his tone. I knew the words weren't meant to comfort. Derek hadn't been a son to me for a long time, not in the way I had hoped. I signed over the house to him 2 years ago to help him get that business loan he'd asked, and I had given. Because that's what you do for family, right? But now, I wasn't sure if I had ever been more alone in my life. The next day, I went to the hospital for a blood test. It didn't take long, but when I got home, the house felt different, too quiet. I opened the door and called out to Derek, but he didn't answer. I walked into the hallway, and my heart sank. The guest bedroom was empty. Furniture had been moved out, stacked in the hallway. My belongings, everything I had ever kept there, was gone. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the mess. Derek came out of the kitchen then, a nonchalant grin on his face. "Hey, Mom," he said, as though everything was normal. "I've been thinking, we need to make the space more functional for Hannah. You know, her job's all remote now, and she's been having stress migraines. She really needs a quiet, stable area to work." His words didn't register at first. I just stared at him, trying to piece together what was happening. Then he added, "I set you up in the garage for now, just for a little while, until we get everything sorted for her. You know how it is." The garage. That's where I was supposed to go. Not the guest room I'd been comfortable in for years, but the cold, dusty garage, just beside the old paint cans and the stacked boxes. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to cause trouble for him and Hannah. After all, they were planning a wedding, so I followed him. Out to the garage. The door opened, and he stepped aside to let me in. There it was. A cot. low to the ground, no padding, just a thin mattress. A space heater beside it, barely strong enough to warm the area. The smell of old cardboard and rusted tools, and in the corner, a plastic bucket with a liner and a roll of toilet paper. The image of it seared into my mind. He was acting like this was temporary, like it would be fine. I nodded like a fool. That night, I lay on the cot, my coat still zipped up, shoes on, staring at the flickering light bulb above me. I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the tiny cracks under the garage door, and I wrapped myself tighter in the thin blanket. The laughter from the kitchen carried through the walls. Derek and Hannah, talking about cupcake flavors. I covered my face, trying to shut out the sounds, until the morning came. The garage smelled faintly of old wood, metal and dust. Not the pleasant kind of dust that settles in a forgotten corner, but the kind that makes you aware of every creak, every shift in the space. I stepped inside, and my feet echoed on the concrete floor. The air was colder here than it had been in the house. I could feel it biting into my bones, and my breath came out in soft puffs. Derek's voice faded behind me, and for a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming. But no, I wasn't dreaming. This was my reality now. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The cot was tucked awkwardly between the water heater and some shelves stacked with old paint cans. The blankets were thin, barely enough to keep warm in the cold garage. The space heater was so small that it barely managed to warm the corner, and in the corner, a 5-gallon bucket sat. A roll of toilet paper perched next to it. I was silent for a long moment, trying to gather myself, trying to understand how my life had come to this. How had I gone from raising Derek, protecting him, giving him everything I had, to being left in a cold garage, isolated and unseen? Derek had acted like this was just a temporary fix. He'd even said so. "It's just for now," he had assured me, "just until Hannah's work setup is done." As if that made sense. As if it explained everything. But the truth was already settling in. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't about Hannah needing a place to work, or about Derek making space for her. This was about something deeper, something colder. This was about me being inconvenient, in the way, something to be shuffled aside. And I knew, somewhere deep inside, that I wasn't being hidden for her benefit. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, like I always did. I told myself it was just a little while, that it wasn't permanent, that it would get better, but deep down I knew it wouldn't. The first night in the garage was worse than I could have imagined. I lay on the cot, the thin mattress barely cushioning me against the hard concrete floor. My coat was still zipped up, my shoes still on, the cold pressing into me like an unwelcome guest. The space heater hummed quietly, a weak attempt at warmth, but I could still feel the chill creeping up my spine. I curled into myself, pulling the blanket tighter, but it didn't help. I could hear Derek and Hannah in the house. Their laughter, their conversations about the wedding plans, filtered through the walls. Cupcake flavors, dinner arrangements, details that didn't matter to me anymore, not when I was stuck in this cold, lonely corner. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the noise, but it only reminded me of everything I had lost. It was as if the garage had swallowed me whole, and no one even noticed. Derek didn't care. Hannah didn't care. They were busy with their lives, their plans, their future. I was just the inconvenience, the piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. I pulled the blanket over my head, but even that didn't protect me from the gnawing feeling that had begun to settle in my chest. I was invisible now. I wasn't even a person to them anymore. I was just something to be dealt with, tucked away in a corner, like an afterthought. The tears came then, but not the kind I had expected, not the kind that came from fear or pain. No, these tears were quiet, like a slow, steady drain of everything I had once been. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my cardigan and tried to quiet my sobs, but they kept coming, a soft, aching rhythm that matched the hum of the space heater. The next morning, I tried to put on a brave face when Lucia arrived. She didn't say anything when she saw me, just paused in the doorway, a look of confusion and concern on her face. I tried to brush it off, telling her it was just temporary, just until Derek and Hannah got things figured out. But Lucia didn't buy it. She didn't say anything, though. Instead, she just stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, and then she handed me a blanket, folded neatly. "Senora Evelyn," she said, her voice soft. I'll bring you something warm later. I didn't want to admit how much I needed it, how much the blanket and her kindness meant to me, but I didn't tell her that. Instead, I just nodded, pretending it was fine. I didn't want to make things awkward for her, didn't want her to feel bad for me. But as she left that day, I noticed something strange. A thermos of oatmeal with cinnamon sat on the workbench, just out of sight. No note, no explanation, but I knew it was from Lucia. I hadn't had a hot breakfast in 4 days. I tried to ignore the gesture, but I couldn't. It was the first real act of kindness I had felt in days. That night, as I lay on the cot, I thought about everything, about Derek's indifference, about Hannah's absence in all of this, and about how I had ended up here, in the coldest, most uncomfortable corner of the house I had once called home. It wasn't just the cancer that was breaking me, it was the isolation, the feeling of being forgotten, of being pushed aside, discarded. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be a mother, not a burden. I had worked my whole life, fought for my family, given them everything I had. And now this was how they repaid me. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. I told myself it was temporary, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The days blurred together after that, each one feeling like the last, each one colder than the next. It wasn't just the physical chill of the garage that gnawed at me, it was the isolation. I never realized how loud silence could be until I was alone in that cold, empty space, with nothing but the low hum of the heater and the distant sounds of Derek and Hannah's lives unfolding inside the house. I could hear them laughing, talking, moving around like a family, while I was forgotten, hidden in this forgotten corner of our home. I'd always been the one who took care of things, always the one who held everything together. There had been days when I felt the weight of it, days when I wished I could lean on someone. But I never did. I didn't need to. I raised Derek alone, worked long hours to provide for us, kept the house in order, always with a smile on my face. I taught him how to ride a bike, how to drive, how to stand up for himself. And then when he needed me most, I signed over the house to him, believing that he would use it to build something better for himself, something secure. Instead, I was shoved aside. No explanation, no apology, just a cold, indifferent move from one room to another, just a space heater and a cot in a damp garage. I hadn't asked for much, just a little consideration. But now, it felt like I was nothing more than a burden to be dealt with, shoved in the corner and forgotten. I used to think Derek was the best thing I had ever done in my life. I poured my love, my time and my energy into him. And now, I felt like a ghost in my own house. He and Hannah had their lives, their future. And me, I was just a faded memory in the background, a distant echo of the woman I had once been. The first few days in the garage were the hardest. I told myself over and over that it was just temporary, that it wouldn't be long before things would change, before Derek would realize how wrong this was. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. He hadn't even bothered to check on me since moving me out here. I had to ask him for a ride to my first chemotherapy appointment, and when he finally agreed, he was late. I had waited in the cold, sitting in the car, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. When he finally came, it wasn't an apology. He barely acknowledged my frustration. He just said, "You could have Ubered, Mom. It wouldn't have been a big deal." And I didn't argue. I didn't even tell him how much it hurt, that he didn't care enough to be there for me. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had no one left. Lucia, my housekeeper, was the only person who seemed to notice. She came twice a week, and though I didn't want to burden her with my misery, I could see the concern in her eyes whenever she looked at me. She never pried, never pushed, but her kindness felt like a lifeline. The first time she left a thermos of oatmeal with cinnamon, I almost cried. No one had thought to bring me food in days. No one had cared. I didn't want to admit how much it meant to me, but it did. Lucia wasn't just cleaning my house anymore. She was taking care of me in ways that no one else had. She showed up when I needed her, even when no one else did. I spent most of my days lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the harsh cold that crept into my bones. The walls of the garage felt like they were closing in on me. Every night, I curled up under the thin blanket, wishing for the warmth of a home I would never feel again. The sounds from inside the house, the clink of glasses, the laughter, the low hum of voices, only reminded me of how alone I was. I used to be part of that world. I used to be the heart of it. But now, I was just a shadow, something in the way, something forgotten. It wasn't just the cancer that was killing me, it was the realization that I had no place in my own life anymore. My son had moved on without me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized he had moved on a long time ago. Maybe even before the diagnosis, maybe before I even signed the house over to him. There was a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake, a growing sense of betrayal that weighed me down every day. I thought I had raised him to be better than this. I thought I had given him everything, but now, here I was, in the cold, with nothing but the steady tick of the clock and the silence that seemed to echo louder with every passing second. Every day, I wrapped my pills in tissues, hiding them in the walls behind insulation, in case I needed them later. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I felt like I had to have options. I had to have something in case things got worse. Because what if Derek didn't come through for me? What if this was it? What if no one was coming to help? The first time I had to use the bucket, I cried afterward, not because of the act itself, but because I realized how quickly I had accepted it. How quickly I had let myself become small, insignificant. It was like I was shrinking in front of my own eyes, and no one cared enough to stop it. I started keeping track of everything: missed appointments, the bucket, the cold meals, the days I went without speaking to anyone. I kept the notebook hidden in a box, just behind a stack of old board games. I didn't know why I was doing it. I wasn't planning to confront Derek. I wasn't planning to do anything. I just needed proof that I wasn't crazy, proof that I wasn't imagining things, that the slow erosion of my dignity was real. I didn't tell anyone about the notebook, but I could feel the weight of it whenever I glanced at it. The evidence was there, buried in the pages, in the dates and the small details that no one else would notice. But I knew what was happening. And it wasn't just my body breaking down, it was my spirit too. My sense of self, of worth, of belonging, was slipping away, bit by bit. The days became a blur of gray, cold mornings, quiet afternoons, and long, lonely nights in the garage. At some point, I stopped counting the days. They were all the same. I'd wake up to the hum of the space heater and the distant sounds of Derek and Hannah inside the house. Sometimes I'd hear the faint clink of dishes or the laughter of people who weren't me. They seemed to live in a world that no longer included me. I had been relegated to this cold, isolated corner where the only warmth came from the small heater beside me, a weak substitute for the love and care I had once hoped to receive from my son. I didn't want to be a burden to Derek, and so I stopped asking. I stopped asking for help with my chemotherapy treatments, for rides to appointments. I started walking to the clinic, knowing that it would be easier for me to make the journey alone than to try and rely on him. The first time I walked to the hospital, I felt the weight of everything, my diagnosis, my abandonment, pressed down on me. But I told myself that this was how things were now. I was no longer someone's priority. I wasn't even on the list. When Derek saw me walking back that day, he didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask how my treatment went. He just muttered something about the groceries and moved past me as though I was invisible. That hurt more than anything else. Not the cancer, not the cold, but the fact that I wasn't even worth a simple question. I wasn't worth the effort to show concern. It wasn't until a week later that I saw Derek again, when he came into the garage while I was sitting in the dim light, wrapped in my coat, holding the small notebook I had begun to keep. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitating, as though he wasn't sure what to say. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice too casual, almost rehearsed. "Maybe it's time to start moving things around in the house. Make room for Hannah's stuff. She needs more space now that she's working from home. And well, you've got the garage." He paused, almost like he was waiting for a response, but I didn't give him one. I didn't need to hear this. I knew what was happening. There was no room for me in their life anymore, no room for me in their plans. I was nothing more than a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be shuffled out of the way. I didn't speak, just nodded like I had been doing since the day he moved me out here. Derek shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the garage. His eyes landed on the cot and the small space heater beside it, and then, without missing a beat, he said, "I'll see if I can find something better for you soon. Don't worry, I'm just trying to get everything organized for Hannah, that's all." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how wrong this all was, how much it hurt, how utterly betrayed I felt. But I didn't. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, again, the weight of the silence between us pressing down like a physical force. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there on the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the cracks under the garage door. I thought about all the years I had spent taking care of Derek, always putting him first, always making sure he had everything he needed. And now, now, I was the one who was left behind, discarded like an old piece of furniture that no one needed anymore. I tried to block out the sound of Derek and Hannah laughing in the kitchen. I could hear them, faintly, talking about wedding details. It made my stomach turn. I didn't want to think about them. I didn't want to feel like this, the hurt, the anger, the sense of abandonment. But I couldn't stop it. The next morning, Lucia arrived, her face etched with concern. When she saw me sitting in the garage, bundled up in my coat, I had no energy to pretend anymore, so I just let her see me for who I was, tired, hurt, and invisible. "Are you okay, Sonora Evelyn?" she asked, her voice gentle, but filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sympathy, maybe, or pity. I didn't know which one I wanted more. I nodded, though my heart wasn't in it. "Just tired, Lucia. It's been a long week," I said, trying to smile. Lucia didn't say anything more. She just sat down beside me, handing me a thermos of tea, the warm steam rising into the cold air. She didn't need to say anything. I could see the way she looked at me, the quiet understanding in her eyes. She didn't need to ask about Derek or the house. She just knew. Later that day, I walked to the mailbox. The walk had become routine. I didn't need anything from it, but I felt the urge to go outside, to stretch my legs. As I opened the mailbox, I saw an envelope with my name on it, a letter from my lawyer. I didn't even hesitate before I opened it. Inside was a bill for an account I didn't recognize, with a balance that made my stomach drop. It was from a credit card I never signed up for, and the charges were all in Derek's name. Tech gear, subscriptions, even a payment to something called BitSaver Holdings. My heart raced as I realized what had happened. Derek had used my name, my credit, to pay off his debts, to fund whatever it was he had been doing. I stood there, holding the letter, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. How had it come to this? How had my son turned into someone who would use me, like this? Someone who had no problem dragging me down with him just to keep his own life afloat. That night, I began writing everything down again. The missed appointments, the bucket in the corner, the tech charges I had never agreed to, the cold meals, the late-night laughter, the ignored phone calls. I didn't know what I was going to do with it all, but I had to do something. I couldn't keep letting it happen without at least recording the truth. I hid the notebook behind the stack of old board games, just like I had done before. It felt like my only lifeline. The days in the garage dragged on, each one like the last. But in the quiet moments between the harsh realities, there was Lucia. She was my only anchor now. Her visits had become the highlight of my week, a small comfort in a life that felt more like survival than living. She never asked probing questions or tried to fix things, but she was present in a way no one else had been in a long time. Her quiet care was a balm for the wounds Derek had caused, and yet, the more she gave me, the more it tore at my pride. Lucia's kindness wasn't just about bringing me food or making sure I had clean towels. It was the way she saw me, the way she didn't let the situation feel completely unbearable. She'd bring me thermoses of soup, oatmeal with cinnamon, and sometimes just a small jar of honey with the note "For you, Sonora Evelyn," from Lucia tucked beneath it. I would try to pretend it wasn't the only real nourishment I'd received in days, but I couldn't help myself. It made the world feel a little more bearable. The first time she brought me soup, I sat in the cold garage, staring at the bowl in my hands like it was a lifeline. The warmth of it made my fingers tingle, and I could feel the tears start to gather in my eyes. How had it come to this? How had I gone from being the one who cared, the one who gave, to being the one who needed to be cared for? And worse still, how was it that the only person showing me any real concern was a woman who worked for me? Lucia didn't press me for answers. She didn't ask about Derek. She didn't ask how I felt. She simply sat beside me, listening when I needed to talk, offering silent comfort when I didn't have the words. and somehow, without even realizing it, she became more than just a housekeeper to me. She became my confidant, my protector. One afternoon, as she was wiping down the counters in the kitchen, I watched her move quietly through the space, her movements fluid and careful. It was something I hadn't seen in a long time. A woman who took pride in doing something as simple as cleaning, as though she cared about it, cared about me. She paused in the doorway to the garage, her eyes lingering on me for just a moment too long. Then, without saying anything, she stepped inside and handed me a small thermos of warm broth. "I thought you might like something warm," she said softly, and my heart twisted at the simple kindness in her voice. "Thank you, Lucia," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I don't deserve it." Lucia didn't reply. She simply nodded, her eyes soft and knowing. It was as if she understood more than I was willing to admit. The silence between us was thick, filled with all the things I hadn't said to anyone. After that, she began staying a little longer on her visits, wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning, rearranging things that were already in order. She made small talk about her family, her children, her husband, but I could sense that she wasn't just passing time. She was checking in on me, watching for signs that I needed help, though I never asked for it. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel ashamed when she did these things. I didn't feel weak. I just felt seen. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in months, perhaps years. It wasn't just the physical acts of care that made me feel alive again. It was Lucia's presence. She was the only person who looked at me and didn't see a problem to fix, didn't see someone to avoid. She simply saw me for who I was, as broken as I was, and still cared. But with each act of kindness, the anger inside me grew stronger. Why was it that Lucia, a woman I had hired to clean my house, treated me better than my own son? Why was it that Derek, the person I had sacrificed everything for, couldn't spare a minute of his time to check on me? It wasn't like I asked him to care for me. He was supposed to be my family, my son, but instead I had been cast aside, left to wither in the cold. And now, all I had was Lucia. I couldn't help but feel guilty for needing her. I wasn't supposed to need anyone, especially not her. It made me question everything, my choices, my life. I had spent so much time focused on Derek, on making sure he was taken care of, on making sure he had everything he needed. I had put all my love and energy into him, and this was how he repaid me. It wasn't just the cancer, it was the loss of everything I had once thought was secure. But I couldn't stay angry at Lucia. I couldn't. She was the only one who had shown me kindness, the only one who had given me something to hold on to. She wasn't the cause of my pain. Derek was. One day, as I sat in the garage, watching the light from the space heater flicker weakly, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. It wasn't Lucia's usual time to visit, and Derek hadn't bothered to check on me in days. I hesitated, unsure whether to even answer, but something in my gut told me I should. When I opened the door, there stood Hannah. She had a bag of groceries in her hand, her eyes a little too wide, like she was nervous. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, her gaze flicking from the garage to me, then back again. "Hi, Signora Evelyn," she said, her voice tight, like she wasn't sure what to do with herself. "I brought some things, some groceries. Derek said you were okay with that. I just thought, it might be good to have something for you." I looked at her, trying to find something in her face that showed me she cared, but I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded and stepped aside to let her in. She set the bag down on the workbench and looked around awkwardly. I didn't know you were staying out here," she said, trailing off. I didn't know what to say. What was there to say? I wasn't sure if she was truly surprised by the state of things, or if she was just pretending not to notice. "I'm fine," I said quietly, trying to make myself sound less bitter than I felt. "It's just for now." Hannah didn't respond. She simply nodded and walked back to the door. But as she left, she glanced at me again, her eyes flicking to the cot, to the space heater, and to the bucket in the corner. It wasn't until the door closed behind her that I realized what had just happened. She had seen me. It was around the third week in the garage that I began to see the truth more clearly. I could no longer deny the weight of everything that had happened. I had spent so many years taking care of everyone else, making sure Derek was okay, making sure the house was in order, that meals were prepared, that there was a roof over our heads. I had always put myself last, but now that I was here, in this cold corner of the world, I realized that no one had put me first. No one even cared enough to check if I was all right. Derek had moved on with his life, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like a ghost. At some point, I started wrapping my pills in tissues, hiding them behind the insulation in the walls. I didn't know what I was preparing for. Maybe I'd never need them, but the idea of being left without options, of being completely dependent on Derek, terrified me. He hadn't been there when I needed him, and I didn't trust him to be there when the cancer took a stronger hold. But I wasn't just afraid of dying, I was afraid of disappearing, of becoming nothing, and I had to make sure that didn't happen. I began writing everything down. Every small detail, every missed appointment, every word that Derek had said that made my heart twist. I didn't have much, just a small notebook, but it was something. It was proof that I hadn't imagined all this, proof that I hadn't been crazy. It was my way of holding on to reality, of not losing myself entirely in the silence and the cold. I didn't want to make a scene, but I had to start keeping track of what was happening. The day Derek moved me out here, the day he stopped checking in on me, the day he told me I could just Uber to my chemo appointment, that was the day I started writing it all down. I had to record the way he made excuses, the way he made me feel like I was the problem. It wasn't just the cancer anymore. It was the slow, subtle way he had turned his back on me. There were days when I wanted to confront him. I wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for why he had turned so cold, why he couldn't see how much he had hurt me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't about me anymore. He had moved on. He was living his life with Hannah, and I was just a shadow in their story. I kept the notebook hidden in a box beneath the stack of old board games in the corner of the garage. No one ever asked me about it, and I was careful not to let anyone see what I was doing. I didn't need their pity. I didn't need to explain myself. But as the days passed, I became more aware of how much I had been lying to myself. I had spent so long pretending everything was fine, pretending that things would get better, but they weren't. They were getting worse, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had been living in the past for too long, holding on to memories of when Derek was a boy, when he needed me. But now, he was a man, and he had moved on. I had to stop waiting for him to come back, to stop hoping that things would go back to how they were. I had to face the truth. Derek wasn't the son I had hoped for. He was someone else entirely. And I couldn't keep pretending that I mattered to him anymore. One afternoon, as I sat in the garage, writing in my notebook, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. My heart skipped a beat. It was Derek, I thought at first, but then I heard the familiar soft knock of Lucia at the door. "Signora Evelyn," she called softly, her voice gentle. "I brought some tea." I sighed in relief. Lucia was the only one who had checked on me in days, the only one who still seemed to care. She stepped inside, holding a thermos of hot tea, her warm smile a stark contrast to the cold garage around me. I hadn't realized how much I needed her presence until she was there, standing in front of me, offering me something warm. "Thank you, Lucia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't stop the tears that welled up in my eyes. I wasn't sure what I was crying for. Was it the kindness of someone who barely knew me, or was it the fact that I had been so alone for so long that even small gestures felt overwhelming? Lucia didn't ask any questions. She simply sat beside me, offering the tea, letting me have my moment, without rushing me or pushing me to explain. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke quietly. "You don't have to go through this alone, Signora Evelyn," she said. "You know that, don't you?" I didn't respond immediately. I just stared at the tea, watching the steam rise from the cup, feeling the warmth on my hands. It was a small comfort, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that there was still kindness in the world, still people who cared, even if they weren't the ones I had expected. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone," I finally said, my voice cracking slightly. "I've always taken care of everything, Lucia. I don't know how to stop doing that." "You're not a burden," Lucia replied softly. "You're not alone. I'm here for you, and I'll stay as long as you need me." Her words settled into my heart like a quiet promise, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was enough to keep me going. The next few days, I spent more time writing in my notebook, documenting every detail, every small moment of neglect, every lie I had quietly accepted. I knew I wasn't going to get answers from Derek, but I had to do something. I couldn't just let him get away with this, with treating me like I was nothing. At the same time, I started to come to terms with something else. I wasn't the same person I had been when I raised Derek. I wasn't the same woman who had taken care of him, who had been the center of his world. I had spent so many years trying to fix everything for him, trying to make his life better, and now it was time to stop. It was time to stop pretending that I could fix everything. It was time to start focusing on myself. As I sat in the cold, dimly lit garage, I couldn't help but drift back to the past, to a time when the world felt different. A time when I wasn't just Evelyn, the old woman in the garage, but a mother, a wife, someone with purpose. The walls of the garage seemed to close in on me at times, but when I closed my eyes, I could still see the house we once lived in, our home, where everything had seemed so full of life. I remembered the early days, when Derek was young, and we lived in a small but cozy house in the suburbs. The kitchen was always warm, filled with the sounds of clattering pots and the smell of dinner simmering. It was a simple life, but it was ours. I worked long hours, but I did it for him. I did it for the future I dreamed of giving him, the one I was determined he would have. I often woke up early, long before the sun, to pack lunches for Derek, to help him with his homework, to make sure he was dressed for school. I remember the sound of his little voice calling for me from the other room, asking for help with his shoes or a toy that had gotten stuck under the couch. He was always so full of energy, so eager to learn, so eager to show me what he could do. I was his world then. He needed me. I was enough. As he grew older, I watched with pride as he blossomed into a young man full of ambition and dreams. But with every passing year, something began to shift. The bond between us, once so tight, started to unravel, thread by thread. I don't know when it happened, or why, but one day I woke up and realized I wasn't the center of his world anymore. He was becoming someone else, someone I didn't fully recognize. I remember the first time I noticed it, the first time he pulled away. He was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, and I had asked him to help me with something. It wasn't a big thing, just moving a few boxes or changing a light bulb, something simple. But he brushed me off, too busy with his friends, too wrapped up in his own life. I didn't say anything at the time. I let it go. But I should have said something. I should have asked him why he had started pulling away. But instead, I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that he was growing up, and that I should let him go. The problem was, I never stopped holding on. Over the years, I kept giving, kept doing for Derek what I thought he needed. I helped him with his college applications, co-signed loans when he started his business, and made sacrifices to make sure he was comfortable. Every time he asked, I gave. I signed over the house to him when he said he needed it to secure a loan. I told myself it was the right thing to do, it was for his future. But it was then that I should have seen the signs. He was taking everything I offered, but he wasn't giving anything back. He was becoming more and more distant, more and more involved in his own life. The last few years were a blur of missed phone calls, unanswered messages, and empty promises. He was busy, too busy for me, too busy to notice how much I needed him, too busy to even notice when I was sick. I let myself get lost in the memories, in the way things used to be. But as the years passed, the house became quieter. Derek spent more time away from home, and I spent more time alone. Even when he was around, it felt like there was a wall between us. I would watch him, and it was like watching a stranger. The bond that once held us together had slowly unraveled until all that was left was silence. But the worst part came when I signed over the house. When I gave Derek everything, thinking it would help him, thinking it would make him more stable, more secure, but I didn't realize that it was the final act in the slow death of our relationship. I thought he needed the house, but in the end, I needed him. And when I needed him most, when the cancer came, he wasn't there. I should have seen it coming. I should have known that signing over the house would mean I was giving up more than just property. I was giving up a piece of myself. That night, I lay on the cot, the thin mattress pressing into my bones. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a jumbled mess of memories, regret, and a quiet rage I had never known I was capable of. How could he do this to me? After everything I had done for him, after all the sacrifices, how could he just walk away and leave me in a cold garage, forgotten? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had allowed it to happen. I had allowed him to pull away, to shut me out, because I had been so focused on giving without asking for anything in return. Giving until I had nothing left. I couldn't change the past, but I could change how I moved forward. I could stop waiting for Derek to come back to me. I could stop hoping he would wake up and realize what he had done. For the first time in a long time, I realized that I needed to stop looking backward. I needed to stop living in the past and start living for myself. It was time to take control again, to stop being the person everyone leaned on and start being the person who took care of herself. The days blurred together in the garage, but in the back of my mind, a plan began to form. It wasn't something I had thought about immediately. In the beginning, all I could think about was the cold, the loneliness, the pain of being abandoned. But as the days stretched into weeks, I realized that I needed to prepare for something else. I needed to take control, to make sure that when I was gone, my legacy was mine to define. I had always put Derek first, always tried to do right by him, but he had shown me exactly how little I meant to him. It wasn't just the cancer, or the garage, or the cold meals he left me with. It was everything, the years of giving and giving, with nothing in return. The years of being told that I didn't matter, that what I needed didn't matter, and it was time for that to stop. I wasn't going to let him take everything I had built, everything my husband and I had worked for, and walk away with it like it was owed to him. I wasn't going to let him destroy what little I had left of my dignity. One afternoon, after Lucia had brought me a cup of tea and we had sat together in silence, I made a decision. I would rewrite my will. I didn't need much, but I needed to make sure that Derek couldn't contest what was mine. I needed to make sure that if something happened to me, Lucia would be the one to handle things, not Derek. She had shown me more kindness in a few weeks than he had in years, and I had to ensure that she would be the one who would protect what I had left. I didn't trust Derek to manage anything anymore. I didn't trust him to do anything except make excuses. He had already shown me how much he cared for me by the way he treated me in the garage, the way he had shut me out. I wasn't going to let him destroy the last bit of stability I had. The process of rewriting my will wasn't easy. It wasn't just about the paperwork. It was about the emotions that came with it. I had never imagined that I would have to go through this, that I would have to think about my legacy in these terms. But as I sat at the small desk in the corner of the garage, the cool wind seeping through the cracks of the door, I realized that it wasn't just about money or property. It was about my voice, my story, my control over what was left of my life. I found a template for a new will online, and with trembling hands, I began to fill it out. I made sure to include a clause that stated that Derek would not be able to contest the will unless he could prove 6 consecutive months of full-time caregiving and financial support. We both knew that wasn't going to happen. I knew it, and deep down I think Derek knew it too. I made sure that everything I owned, everything I had left, would go to Lucia. Not because I owed her, but because she had earned it. She had shown me more compassion than my own son, and for that, I trusted her more than anyone else. The house, the small savings I had managed to put aside, everything that had once been Derek's inheritance, it was all going to her. When I finished filling out the new will, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a statement. It was me taking control, taking my life back, even if only in this small way. I wasn't going to let Derek erase me completely. I wasn't going to let him define who I was or how I would be remembered. The next day, I walked to the library to print the documents. The walk wasn't far, but it felt like the longest journey I had ever taken. I could feel the weight of the papers in my bag, the reality of what I was doing pressing down on me with every step. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was the only way I could make sure that my wishes would be respected, that my voice would be heard after I was gone. When I returned to the garage, I immediately emailed the documents to the lawyer who had helped me with the house before. I asked her to review them, to make sure everything was in order. I didn't trust Derek to get the house, and I didn't trust him to make sure I got the care I needed. I couldn't leave it to chance anymore. And then I did something I hadn't thought about before. I called Lucia. She arrived the next day, and I could see the concern in her eyes when she saw the pile of papers on the table. I handed her the will, the living trust documents, and the medical directives. I didn't need to explain much to her. She already knew. She had been with me through the hard moments, the ones that Derek had ignored, and I trusted her. I want you to be the one to handle things, I said softly. I want you to make sure everything goes according to my wishes. Lucia looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with understanding. Of course, Senora Evelyn. I'll do everything you ask. You have my word. And just like that, I knew I had made the right decision. Lucia wasn't just my housekeeper, she had become my ally, my friend, the one person who would ensure that my legacy was honored. Days passed, and I found myself checking my email obsessively. I had sent the revised will and trust documents to the lawyer, but I had yet to hear back. My thoughts were constantly swirling. I had done what I could. I had made sure that the last pieces of my legacy were in place, that the house, our house, would be in good hands when I was gone. But there was still Derek. And I knew that sooner or later he would have to confront what I had done. It was late one evening, when he finally came. I heard the car in the driveway, the familiar rumble of his engine, as it pulled to a stop. My heart clenched at the sound. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to face him again, to confront the man who had cast me aside like I was nothing. But there was no avoiding it. The time had come. He knocked softly at first, his usual polite tap on the door that I had always ignored in the past. But this time, there was no ignoring it. I stood up from the cot and walked toward the door, taking a deep breath before I opened it. "Hey, Mom," Derek said, his voice too casual, too practiced. He looked at me, his eyes darting around the garage, but he didn't say anything about it. No apology, no concern, just that same detached tone that had become so familiar. "Can we talk?" I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring at him. I didn't want to let him in. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he still had any control over me. But I knew this conversation was inevitable. I had to face him now, just as I had faced everything else in my life. "Come in," I said, my voice steady, despite the turmoil inside me. I stepped back and motioned for him to enter. He walked inside, glancing around at the cluttered space. His face twisted for a moment, as if disgusted, but he quickly masked it with his usual indifference. "This is where you're staying?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. I guess I didn't realize. I didn't know it was that bad. I nodded slowly, my gaze never leaving his. "It's temporary," I said, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. "Just until you and Hannah get settled." "Right," he replied, his voice flat. "Well, we need to talk." I raised an eyebrow, but I didn't say anything. He had made it clear from the moment he moved me out here that he didn't care about my feelings, that I was just an inconvenience. But now, something was different. Now he was the one standing in front of me, trying to explain himself. I didn't know if I was supposed to listen, or if I was supposed to shut him out completely. I couldn't decide. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I found something," he said, his voice lowering. "Something about the will, the changes you made." At that, my heart skipped a beat. I had been waiting for this moment. I knew he would try to contest it, to find some way to undo everything I had done. But hearing him say it out loud made everything feel so real, so final. "I assume you're talking about the changes I made to the will," I said, my voice calm, though inside I was seething. "I didn't make them lightly, Derek. But I had to. I couldn't leave everything to you, not after what's happened." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I saw the familiar arrogance that had always defined him. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "I've been taking care of things. I've been handling everything. I'm the one who's been making sure the house is kept up. I'm the one who's been supporting you." "Supporting me?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Is that what you call it? Moving me into a cold garage and ignoring me for weeks? Is that your idea of support, Derek? Because if it is, then we've got a serious problem." His face flushed with anger, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice tight with frustration. "I've been busy, okay? Things aren't going well for me. Hannah's been stressed out, and I'm trying to keep it all together. I didn't need this from you. Not now. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I could feel the years of hurt rising to the surface, but I wouldn't let him see me crack. You didn't need this from me. You didn't need the house, or the loan, or the support I've given you your whole life. My voice shook with the weight of it, but I kept going. Well, let me tell you something, Derek. I don't need you either. Not anymore. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched. The silence between us felt thick, like a dam ready to break. But he didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting for me to back down. I'm not going to change my mind, I said, my voice steady and firm. The will is final. You don't get to take everything I have just because you think you deserve it. You don't get to treat me like this and expect everything to go back to normal. I'm done. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue, to tell me that I was being unreasonable, but he didn't. Instead, he looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I've been under a lot of pressure, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I cut him off again. It doesn't matter. You've made your choices, Derek. And now, you'll have to live with them. He didn't respond. He just turned and walked out of the garage, his footsteps heavy and filled with the weight of everything we had both lost. The silence in the garage became my constant companion. After that confrontation with Derek, things didn't change. In fact, they only grew worse. He didn't visit. He didn't call. The space heater was still my only source of warmth, and the days stretched endlessly, each one a faint echo of the last. It felt like time itself was stalling, waiting for something to happen, for someone to act, but no one did. Lucia continued to visit, though. She brought food, always with a warm smile, and sat with me in the dim, cold space. She didn't ask about Derek or try to comfort me with empty words. Instead, she just stayed. Her presence was quiet, steady, like the calm after a storm. I was grateful for her, more than I could express, but at the same time, it hurt. The reality of my life had become a blur of cold meals and fleeting moments of warmth. But Lucia wasn't the one I had raised. She wasn't the one who had promised to look after me when I was older, to care for me when the time came. Derek had been that person. But that person had disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to care about nothing but himself. One morning, when Lucia arrived with a thermos of tea, I noticed something different in her eyes. She had been lingering longer on her visits, wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning, straightening things that were already in order. But that day, there was a deeper concern, a heaviness I couldn't ignore. "Senora Evelyn," she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to go to the doctor. You haven't been for a checkup in weeks, and I've been noticing you're not eating like you should." I had known she was right. I had been too weak, too tired to care for myself properly, but I hadn't wanted to face the truth. I didn't want to admit to myself how much worse things were getting, how much worse I was getting. But as I looked into Lucia's face, I realized I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep denying the reality of my condition. Not when I had someone who genuinely cared about me, someone who wanted to help. "I'll go," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "But only if you promise to come with me." Lucia nodded without hesitation, the warmth of her gesture giving me the courage I needed to finally face what was coming. The following morning, Lucia drove me to the clinic. I hadn't been there in weeks, not since the time Derek had forgotten to take me. When we arrived, I felt the familiar pang of nervousness, but this time it was different. I wasn't going in alone. For the first time in a long while, I had someone who cared enough to walk with me. The doctor was kind, his voice gentle as he listened to my symptoms. He ran a few tests, checked my vitals, and gave me a brief rundown of my condition. The cancer was progressing, though I already knew that. What I hadn't realized, though, was how much the neglect, the isolation, had been affecting me. "You need to take better care of yourself," the doctor said gently. "You can't continue to let yourself fall into this pattern. You have people who care about you, let them help." The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. People who cared about me. It sounded so simple, so obvious, but for so long I had felt like no one cared. But now, as I sat there in that sterile office, with Lucia by my side, I realized something. I didn't need to keep pretending I was fine. I didn't need to keep pushing away the help that was being offered. Maybe it wasn't Derek who was supposed to help me. Maybe it was time to accept the kindness of those who had been there all along. When we got back to the garage, I sat down on the cot and looked at the small notebook I had been writing in. The pages were full of the same complaints, the same hurt, but now I had a choice. I could keep writing down the same things, dwelling on the past, or I could start a new chapter. It was up to me now. Lucia stayed for a while that evening, helping me get settled. As she left, she turned to me with a smile, one that was full of quiet understanding. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said, "and I'll make sure you get everything you need." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. I just nodded and watched her leave, feeling the weight of her words sink in. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a future, even if it was uncertain. The next few days were filled with small changes. I started taking my medication more regularly, eating what Lucia brought me, and making sure I went to my appointments. It wasn't easy. The cancer was still there, still taking its toll on my body. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something for myself. I wasn't just sitting in the cold, waiting for something to change. I was taking control. And yet, every time I thought about Derek, a pang of regret hit me. Why hadn't I seen the signs sooner? Why had I given him everything without asking for anything in return? And more importantly, why hadn't I demanded more for myself? But that wasn't something I could change now. What I could change was how I moved forward. I could stop waiting for him to come back. I could stop hoping for things to go back to the way they were. I had to let go of the past and start living for what little time I had left. The days that followed felt like a haze, a quiet waiting. I kept to my routine, though I knew that it wouldn't be long before things took their final turn. My body, though fighting with what little strength it had left, was no match for the relentless toll of the cancer. Still, I carried on, trying to hold on to whatever semblance of life I could, determined to maintain some shred of dignity in my last days. The thing about dying is that you never really know when it's going to happen. You can feel it coming, feel it creeping up on you, like the cold drafts in the garage, but you can never truly prepare for it. It sneaks up, takes you by surprise, and suddenly, the world you once knew feels like a distant memory. I'd always been someone who prided myself on control. In my life, I'd been the one who made things happen, who held everything together, but now, as I lay there on the cot, it became clear to me that there was nothing left to control. I couldn't control my body. I couldn't control Derek's indifference. I couldn't control the past. But what I could control was how I faced the end. Lucia's visits continued. Quiet, steady, always bringing warmth and kindness, always checking in on me. She didn't ask me about Derek. She didn't need to. She was there, and that was enough. Her presence had become my solace. She wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. She had become my friend, my confidant, the one person who truly understood. But one morning, as I sat sipping tea, a heaviness came over me. I knew it was time. I didn't know when exactly, but I knew it would be soon. The pain had become more constant, the weakness more pronounced. I could feel myself fading. I had no fear, not anymore. In a way, the finality of it all was strangely comforting. It was then that I made my final decisions. I had lived a life of sacrifice, of giving, and now it was time to make sure that my choices, my voice would remain after I was gone. I had made sure that Lucia would be taken care of, that the house would stay in her hands where it belonged. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a punishment. It was simply the only way to make sure that I was remembered, not as a burden but as someone who had lived with dignity. When I passed, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene of pain or struggle. It was quiet, peaceful. I had gone to sleep the night before with the knowledge that I had done what I could. I had fought as long as I could, and now it was time to rest. Lucia was the one who found me the next morning. She came into the garage to check on me, as she always did, but this time she stopped in the doorway, a soft gasp escaping her lips when she saw that I was no longer breathing. She didn't cry out. She didn't make a scene. She simply walked over, placed her hand on my forehead, and whispered a prayer under her breath. She stayed there for a while, just sitting beside me, as though she needed to say goodbye. I never asked her to, but I was glad she did. The news of my death didn't reach Derek for a while. He hadn't checked in, hadn't called, hadn't come by to see me in weeks, but when he found out, it wasn't what I had expected. He didn't break down in tears. He didn't rush to the house to take care of things. He was just distant, detached. A few days after my death, he showed up at the house, walking through the door with a stiff, uncomfortable expression, like he was playing a part in a story he no longer cared about. The funeral was small. Just a few of the people who had actually known me. Lucia was there, standing beside me, and I could feel her sadness, her quiet grief. She had become the person who cared for me when no one else did, and I was grateful for that, in ways I would never be able to express. I had written my letter to Derek, though I knew he would probably never read it. I had left it sealed, hidden in an envelope, for when he finally decided to take notice of what I had left behind. In that letter I told him everything I had wanted to say, everything I had never had the courage to tell him in life. I hadn't wanted to hurt him, but I needed to make sure he understood. I had given him everything, but in the end, I had been the one who was forgotten, the one who had been left in the cold. I needed him to know that I saw everything, everything he had done, and everything he hadn't. A week after my death, Derek finally tried to contest the will. Of course, it wasn't really about the house. It was about control, about not wanting to accept that I had made a decision without him. He tried to argue that the will had been influenced, that I hadn't been in the right state of mind when I made it. But it didn't matter. The evidence was clear. The recordings, the affidavits, the medical records. Everything was in place, and the judge dismissed his challenge almost immediately. It was over. There was nothing more for him to fight. In the end, it was Lucia who got the keys to the house. She didn't sell it. She didn't turn it into something cold and clinical. Instead, she moved her family in. She turned the garage into a reading room, and she made sure the house stayed a home, just as I had always wanted it to be. I never knew if Derek ever drove by, or if he even cared. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it didn't matter anymore. The house was still standing, just as it had always been, and my legacy, what little was left of it, was secure. Not through Derek's hands, but through Lucia's. Lucia didn't waste time after my death. She had always been practical, a woman of quiet action, and I knew that whatever happened next, she would handle it with the same steady, unassuming strength that she had shown throughout my final months. When I made her my executor, I hadn't just trusted her with my possessions, I had trusted her with my story, with the remnants of a life that had been overshadowed by the neglect of the person I had loved most in the world. The first thing she did was move her family into the house. She didn't sell it, didn't turn it into a money-making venture. She brought her husband and children into the space that I had once filled with my life, my hopes, and my quiet dreams of a family that cared for each other. She gave the house new life, breathing warmth and laughter into the rooms that had once been filled with nothing but silence. When I was alive, I had spent years trying to make things work for Derek. I gave him everything. I sacrificed for him, thinking that one day he would understand, but he didn't. He never saw the sacrifices, never realized the toll it took on me, and in the end, he discarded me like yesterday's news. But Lucia, despite everything, saw me, and now she was taking what I had left behind and turning it into something that I could be proud of. The garage, once cold and lifeless, became a room full of light. Lucia and her family cleaned it out, swept away the dust that had settled there during my last months. They painted the walls and added bookshelves, turning the space I had once spent my final days in into a reading room, a place of peace and warmth. I could almost see the transformation in my mind's eye, a room full of sunlight, with books stacked high, where people could come and sit, quietly reading, living. I imagined Lucia sitting there, surrounded by her children, teaching them the things I had hoped to teach Derek. How to value what really matters, how to be present, how to love, without asking for anything in return. She had done more for me in my last years than anyone else ever had, and now she was taking the house I had once called home and making it into something that reflected the person I had been before. Everything fell apart, the person who had loved her family, who had poured everything into them, never asking for anything back. A few months after my death, I learned from Lucia that she had decided to start a small garden in the backyard. She had planted flowers, violets, lilacs, and lavender flowers. I had once loved to grow when I was younger. I had always thought of gardening as something soothing, something that connected me to the earth, to life itself. Now, the flowers were planted in my honor, as though they were a living reminder of the woman I had been, the woman who had once loved the simple things. Lucia told me, during one of our visits, that she had asked her children to help her tend to the garden. They were young, but she had explained to them how important it was to grow things, to nurture life. She told them that the flowers were for me, for the woman who had once lived here, and that every time they saw a new bloom, they should remember that there was always beauty in the world, even when it seemed lost. The garden became a symbol of life going on. Even though I was gone, the love I had planted, the lessons I had taught, didn't die with me. They lived on in the quiet moments that Lucia shared with her family, in the flowers that bloomed every spring, in the house that had once been filled with my life, now being filled with theirs. Lucia didn't talk about me much after I was gone. She didn't need to. She carried me with her in the quiet moments, in the way she had transformed my home into something beautiful, something full of love and life. I wasn't forgotten. Not by her, not by the people who had truly cared. I had never wanted a big funeral, never wanted to be remembered with grand gestures. I wanted to be remembered quietly, in the little things, in the moments that others might overlook. The way Lucia cared for the house, the way she brought new life to the garage, made it a place of warmth, not cold, neglect. The way she had planted those flowers, as if she were honoring the past while looking to the future. When I had been alive, I had hoped that Derek would see the importance of what I had done, of all the sacrifices I had made for him. I had hoped that one day he would understand the love I had poured into our family. But now, looking back, I realized that it wasn't Derek who had learned the lessons I had hoped to teach him. It was Lucia. A year after my passing, I learned that Lucia had invited Derek to the house. She hadn't told me, but I could imagine it perfectly, the quiet, tense meeting that would have taken place in the living room, the room that had once been filled with warmth, now with its new life. I imagined the discomfort in Derek's eyes, the guilt creeping in as he saw the flowers in the garden, the books on the shelves, the life that had blossomed in the place where he had abandoned me. I wondered if he had finally understood, if he had seen what I had always hoped for him. I wondered if he had realized that in the end, it wasn't about the house, or the money, or the things we gave away, it was about what we left behind. I didn't expect Derek to change overnight. I didn't expect him to suddenly come around and see the truth, but I hoped, in some quiet corner of my soul, that one day he would realize what he had lost. Not the house, not the money, but me, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, the woman who had given everything to make sure he had a better life, even if he never saw it. Lucia, however, didn't need to change. She had seen the truth all along. She had seen the love I had given, the sacrifices I had made, and she had honored it in the only way that mattered, by living her own life with the same quiet dignity, the same deep compassion, and by making sure that the lessons I had tried to teach were passed down.